welcome. You're listening to Latin Waves with your hosts, Sylvia and Stuart Richardson. Latin Waves is more than just hot rhythms. This is a show about community, about creating a culture that is inclusive and based on fairness. Because everyone deserves dignity, respect, and has something to contribute. A new world is possible, and it all starts with us. You are listening to Latin Waves. I'm your host, Sylvia Richardson. I'm delighted this morning to be joined by Graham Russell. He's the founder of Rights Action. Thank you so much for joining us, Graham.
Hi, Sylvia.
Hi, good
Happy
morning.
New Year, and thanks for having me on.
Happy New Year. Now, while the news are having very fun, festive, fear-infusing news about the incidents in the White House, which are, very worthy, I'd like us to talk a little bit about the perhaps continuous stories of horror of the Honduran people as a caravan of 7,000 asylum seekers left early in January. So perhaps we can begin there.
Well, it is a good starting point. It's a sad and it's a poignant starting point for any discussion about sort of what's going on in Central America and what does that have to do with North America, with Canada and the U.S. And if anyone's following the news, and it's been a little bit in the mainstream news in Canada and the U.S., there's yet another caravan of desperate people fleeing Honduras, trying to get to exile of some sort of healthy, sane place to live in either Mexico or the United States. Any mainstream coverage that does shine a light on this focuses narrowly sort of on there's thousands of Hondurans fleeing, trying to get into Guatemala. They're trying to march across Guatemala. These are very hard conditions. They're fleeing conditions of violence and poverty, and that's about it. Like I'm being a little bit simplistic, but that's sort of about it. And there's no discussion of what are the real underlying causes that they're fleeing, and what are the causes of the underlying causes, and what does that have to do with Canadian and U.S. policies. And this narrow coverage of the caravans almost becomes like sort of caravans or poverty voyeurism. Like we're shining a light at a very complex, sad, depressing situation of poor people, but doing it almost in a voyeuristic way, that this is not our problem. We're just looking at someone else's problem and not analyzing it on a more proper, deeper level.
I was just going to say that, in a world full of pandemic fear with millions of people dying worldwide, a lot of people are focused on, their own house, and they think, how can we worry about this? But we don't see how, the repression that imposing a coup in Honduras in 2008 has created, a complete erosion of social systems, and how those seemingly isolated incidents, are generated from policies right in our home. So perhaps we can talk a little bit about the role of imperialism, because we often don't use that term, in polite conversations. We don't talk about colonization and imperialism as things that are, worthy of discussion. But I think it's timely to speak about the way our government, Canadian government, the U.S. government, imperialist policies have generated this level of suffering and make those connections.
Yeah. Any discussion about these caravans that are leaving Honduras, and it's similar arguments can be made about the caravans of people, thousands, tens of thousands leaving Guatemala every year. But just to focus on Honduras, this caravan that's of desperate people fleeing their country, the underlying causes go back to the U.S. and Canadian-backed military coup in June of 2009 in Honduras. You're right to point directly at that. And the caravans became news in North America, mainly in the U.S., but also in Canada in 2018 and 2019, And the coverage was similarly sort of poignant, but not focusing on the role of Canada and the US. And this is what I was trying to say. This is the same thing that's happening now. There's poignant coverage of the suffering of people fleeing and no coverage whatsoever about how Canadian and US policies from 2009, from the coup that we supported in 2009 forward to today, our public sector government policies and then the investor and corporate interests of Canadian and US based companies and investment firms are directly contributing to and actually benefiting from the underlying causes of human rights violations, of deep impoverishment, of racism, of corruption, and of government violence and repression. And there is no end in sight in this for the sake of Honduras until we start to address the role that the quote unquote international community it has been playing in Honduras from the coup in 2009 forward till today, without going back further in history. And so the coup, this U.S. Canadian-backed coup, is the starting point for any honest discussion about what all the ills that the people of Honduras are facing today.
Talk a little bit about the significance of having mining companies' interests dictate the policies the Canadian pursue in countries such as Honduras, and what are some of the impacts that this has generated?
I will. There is a direct link between the coup in Honduras and mining, Canadian and even U.S. mining interests. There's a direct coup link between the coup in Guatemala in 1954 and Canadian mining interests. But to cast the discussion farther, there's a direct coup between these regime change policies that are in Latin America. They're always sort of spearheaded by the United States, and then Canada almost invariably supports them directly or indirectly. There's direct links between the regime change policies that overthrow governments that we don't like and put in place governments we do like, and a wide range of North American economic and investor interests in the sectors of mining, in the sectors of the construction of hydroelectric dams, in the sectors of the production of bananas and pineapples for export, in the sectors of the production of African palm and sugarcane for export, in the sectors of tourism and in the maquilador sweatshop sectors of the economy. There's direct links between why the US and Canadian governments choose to support certain right-wing governments that promote global businesses or overthrow governments we don't like to bring into power, help bring into power governments we do like, i.e. governments and regimes that favor the economic interests of global corporations and investors, most of which in Latin America are based in North America. And so that the story about mining is really no different than the story about where do our bananas come from and how did they get here? Where do our pineapples come from and how did they get here? Sugarcane, African palm, etc.
You know, when I was a kid, growing up in El Salvador under the war, it became a daily occurrence of horror. You know, you become adaptive to your environment. And in many ways, I think the experience of Hondurans living in caravans is an adaptive measure to oppression and repression, this ability to join forces with others to try to create safety. We used to say in El Salvador, you can have the security you can afford. And it usually meant we were resigned to face the fact that we could die that day just by going outside our homes. And so, can we talk about the ways then that these policies not only dehumanize, you know, our own ability to empathize, to support people's right to freedom, right to be, you know, just this very novel idea. The being means being without aggression, facing aggression on a daily basis. This ability to become, to be able to use your creativity and your skills and
Hmm.
flourish. So
Yeah.
let's talk about what significance this has on our own ability to see that injustice when it happens
Right.
in our own backyard.
Like, just for the sake of the discussion, very interesting. I find this very interesting. The most dehumanizing agent, or the most desensitizing agent in this discussion, is the role of the media, and is the role of how these issues are presented to the general public by our politicians and media, or in the cases where the media doesn't really address it at all, or our politicians in Canada and the US ignore it. What I'm getting at is that, take the caravans, for example. Because our media only gives us snapshots of these, and they sometimes refer to them as hordes of people, or a wave of people, or a flood of people trying to get north. They present them in a snapshot vision of large numbers of people in terrible conditions trying to do something almost impossible, i.e., get through military roadblocks to walk north in conditions of poverty to the US, knowing that they won't get in. The desensitizing, the dehumanizing part is the endless repetition of this one image. That's what's going on there, and isn't that too bad? And no connection to what are the underlying causes of all this, and how we are part of this problem. And the reason it's desensitizing is because when people in Canada or the US read these news reports, A, they'll either ignore them altogether, or B, they'll read them, and get moved in their hearts. But but then we throw up our hands and go, what can I do about it? That's all those people over there ever do. They hurt one another, they're violent, they're impoverished and corrupt, and then they flee. And that's the desensitizing part, because it's disconnecting us, Canada and the US, to what's going on there. And if the media and our politicians did their jobs rightly, then there would be much more indignation in Canada and the US amongst the general public, because the general public would be indignant that we have something to do with this. The Canadian and US government policies have a lot to do with it, that our companies and investors have a lot to do with it. And therefore, there's something that I, the Canadian news consumer, the American news consumer, can do about it, because I won't stand for this. I will not stand for this, that my government, my companies, my investors are doing this and helping create these conditions elsewhere. So that the desensitizing and the dehumanizing part of it is the endless repetition of the suffering of others, and the complete disconnection to how we're all in this together, and how our policies and actions create and recreate the suffering of others.
I love that you bring down to the connection to how the things that we consume, the ways that we consume media, the ways that we consume goods, whether we're buying gold without thinking, where did this gold come from? How was it
Yeah.
mined? Were the miners paid reasonable wages? Was the water contaminated? Do they have left any clean water to drink in the area where the gold was extracted? Those kinds of questions are questions that we often ignore. So, as you started Rise Action, your foundation looks not just to the superficial root causes of poverty, which many people say, well, they live in a poor country, so they're poor people. But the countries are rich. The countries are rich with gold. The countries are rich with minerals. Countries like Venezuela are rich with oil. The people are poor because of the policies put in place, the minimum wage that's non-existent in some areas. The name of Manuel Zelaya will be, alien to most people. Most Hondurans will remember as the year where the the government tried to impose a small increase, in their salary,
Yeah.
and and the government was brought down. So those connections are essential, not just for our own understanding that poverty is not a natural state of being, that this, a poverty that
Yeah.
kills people faster than a coronavirus, it's
Yeah.
actually created by policies of what people should earn, how much investment should generate from their exploitation of their minds, and how many juridical tools the investment elites have at their disposal that dehumanize and turn
Hmm.
people into disposable, means to their capital. So, how do you keep yourself connected?
Yeah.
How do you feel? How do you keep sensitized to the suffering, to the pain, so that you don't see it as just another day of poor people trying to leave their corrupt places?
I guess it's a two-part answer, and one is I've worked in Central America, mainly Honduras and Guatemala, but also El Salvador that you mentioned, Nicaragua, for better over 3 decades. And I have many friends there, many friends who are living and suffering in these very conditions. And so I can never be insensitive about it when these are people I know, and they're people like my neighbors here at home. They're just honest, decent people trying to have decent, simple lives, and they're being forced to suffer through very, very brutal, harsh conditions of violence, impoverishment, racism, impunity, and corruption. If these are people I know, and I do, then I'm not insensitive to that. But the other part of the answer is also that I also understand that these are not their problems, that these are our problems, that these are in part my problems by definition. And I think that is the greatest challenge. And that's one of the greatest challenges in the line of work I do, is to keep chipping away at sort of redefining what are the underlying causes, what are the underlying local to national to global causes of so many of the ills that people face around the world, including in places like Guatemala and Honduras. It's not to redefine what is suffering. Oh, that person's in poverty. That looks awful. That's terrible. Most of us can sort of agree on that. It's redefining what are the underlying causes, local to national to global causes, and then taking action, not chipping away, relentless action, week after week, year after year, decade after decade. Well, A, hold accountable, and B, transform what are the local to national to global underlying causes. And that work began long before I was born, and it will continue long after I've died.
It's such a touching statement, when I hear you say that war began before I was born, because to me, the vision of a world with justice for all people is a dream that is bigger than all of us. And when you have a dream that is bigger than you have very good reasons to get up in the morning and get to work and do your part. So,
Yes.
how do we create then in ourselves, and how do you cultivate that sense of resilience when you're faced with aggression, around you? Here in Canada, we see the treatment of Indigenous people. We see how pipelines displace people, how mining companies are polluting water and lakes. And how do you keep yourself energized and committed to create a world where that is not natural way of doing business, that is not an inescapable fate in the name of capital progress?
Just in a nutshell, maintaining and nurturing positive human relations and maintaining and nurturing positive actions to respond to all this stuff. There's a quote out there, and I'm going to misquote the quote. I don't even know who said it first, but that action is the mother of hope. And as opposed to just having good hope or thinking your way into being hopeful about something, action is the way that one's hopeful. Now, that's easier said than done for someone like me than it is for someone who's suffering the harms on a daily basis, on a lifelong basis, on an intergenerational basis. And that is a big gap between my reality and the reality of many people that I work with, know, am friends with, and support. But it's still true that on a day-to-day basis, because that's where we all live day to day, action, do good work, do good actions. The caravans, just to bring it right back to that discussion, this is the positive thing that those thousands and tens of thousands of Hondurans can do in their life. They're not just accepting of their imposed exploitation and poverty. They're not just accepting of being governed and ruled by a military-backed drug trafficking regime in Honduras that's fully supported by Canada and the US. They're choosing to act. Now, different Hondurans are choosing to act in different ways. But those thousands of people fleeing the country, and they'll be fleeing again tomorrow and next week and next month, they are choosing to act. Their hope in life derives from the choices they're making to act upon their reality. And thus me, in a life living in Toronto, my little micro world is one of sort of privilege and comfort, relatively speaking, compared to that of the Hondurans. My hope comes from the actions I get to do every day, week in, week out, with good people, the relationships I've developed with good people in Canada, the US, and in Central America.
That's beautiful. How can people support your work? How can people participate in?
I think that the best thing for anyone is just start following us on our on Facebook, on Twitter, Instagram. Got some new younger people working with me now, so social media side of our work is growing and improving. Or probably the best thing is our email list. We send out regular information through these email news blasts. It's free. You just sign up and you start receiving the information. Once you start receiving the information on a regular basis, the reader, whoever it is, will start to receive a lot of sort of potential action lists and links to other groups and links to places they can donate and links to things they can do here at home in Canada. It's sort of a very proactive sort of information. When we send out information, we try and make it proactive. So it's not just reporting on the news, but telling people what they can do. But the best thing is to start following the information regularly and then get used to and aware of our work and our perspective on our work, and then go from there.
I always say the community is immunity. So give our audience your link and your website so they can follow you and be part of a greater community.
Rightsaction.org. And if you go to the website, there'll be a spot where you can subscribe to our email news blasts, and you'll find information about Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. But it's rightsaction.org.
Thank you so much for the work you do. Thank you so much for the beautiful ways that you remind us of our responsibility to co-create with life, to be on the side of life. And
thank you very much, Sylvia.
Take care.
We've come to the end of our show, Latin Waves. Latin Waves is an internationally syndicated weekly program made available through campus and community stations and available out to the world at www.latinwavesmedia.com. Visit Latin Waves Media to hear previous shows, to access resources, or support our efforts towards social change via community project engagement.